Autumnal type morning, even though we're supposed to be midsummer. Thank you for your attendance this morning to members and members of the public as well. We do appreciate your contribution and your commitment. I'd like to welcome again, obviously, all the members that we've seen before, but Councillor Morris and Councillor Settle, I don't think has actually attended a planning meeting, and so this is their first time. So a particularly warm welcome to you two, and thank you very much for coming. This morning we start with the agenda in terms of declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? So we move on to item 2, which is confirmation of minutes for the meeting on the 5th of July. Could we have a proposer? Yes. Councillor Collins, thank you. A seconder, Councillor Griffiths, thank you. And then substitute members, I believe that we have one substitute member.
Yes, so Councillor Michelle Morris is here on behalf of Councillor Jane Nixon. All
right, thank you for substituting this morning and joining the clan. Okay, we hope you enjoy the experience this morning. All right, well, thank you for coming. Let's move on to decision items. We're going to, we had two.
That temporarily. Thank you.
There we are. What I'd like to say is that in terms of the speakers, what I do is normally introduce an officer to make a very brief introduction rather than a full presentation. We then bring in the speakers who make their contribution. Usually it's 3 minutes. If it's a ward councillor, then obviously that's unlimited time. And then after that, we resume with the full presentation. And that's worked fairly well in the past.
Sorry, Chairman, just thinking about the public speaking a little more thoughtfully. The reason that the applicant was
Comfortable with that, thank you. I think, did the agent hear that explanation? So there's no snub here. We know you're here and you're very welcome to listen to the debate regarding that particular item. But there's probably no reason why you can be allowed to speak at the moment. Okay, so we're going to go to item 2 anyway, I think, and we'll deal with item 2, which is page 20 on your agenda. And this is change of use of dwelling house, which is class C3, to a home for one young person, no older than 18 years of age, with care provided 24 hours a day, up to 3 non-resident carers working in shifts, which is within the C2 category, and it is a retrospective application. So I'm going to ask Andrew now to make his presentation, So I'll hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everybody. Yes, this application relates to, as the Chairman says, it's a property in Elswick, number 1 Rosica Drive. So the image on the screen shows you Elswick. Sorry, just let me... right, I know. Right, that shows you Elswick. The red circle indicates the approximate location of the property. So you can see it's relatively central to the village. The property it's a detached 2-storey dwelling. It's in the, like I say, it's in the settlement area. It used to be a hot food takeaway, fish and chip shop, until around 2015 when it was changed into a residential property, and it's on a sort of a cul-de-sac of residential dwellings. As the Chairman mentioned in his introduction, the scheme is to change the use of the dwelling to a care home, which is for, in this case, is for 1 young person with 3 resident carers working in shifts to provide care for that young person. It is retrospective, as I believe the young person occupied the property a couple of months back. There have been objections from the parish council, and I appreciate Councillor Hayhurst not here to explain them, but they are in the agenda papers in full, which cover their concerns which relate to the parking arrangements at the property and the suitability of that use in Elswick as a village. I think there's reference to limited services being available. But the officer recommendation is to grant planning permission in this case. So just to provide a little bit more context to you, this is the street view image, which is a little dated now and obviously dates back to the previous use of the property. So it's the property in the foreground there with fish and chips on the front. You can see the remainder of the street, all pretty standard 2-storey residential dwellings. That's the current situation. So slightly different image from street view in the top left. Bottom right is how the property looks now. That picture was taken last week on a surprisingly sunny day. But you can see the property hasn't changed other than the signage has gone, and it clearly has had a new windows, and it looks much more domestic because it is a domestic dwelling. In terms of the layout of the property, nothing particularly surprising there. Ground floor accommodation, as you would expect. First floor provides 2 bedrooms, one of which would be for staff and one of which would be for the young person. So it's a chalet dorm bungalow, windows front and rear serving those bedrooms, and then a bathroom in the dormer to the side. Under this proposal, there are no alterations to the property, so it's not being extended. There's no new windows, none of that kind of change. So the first thing that we would look at is whether planning permission is needed for this particular use. The current use clearly a residential dwelling, which is Class C3 in planning terms. The proposal is to provide care for 1 young person. Now, as young people legally cannot be a household, the children cannot look after themselves, there is always a requirement for care. In this case, this care is provided by others, by members of staff who are part of a household somewhere else. They live elsewhere whilst they do stay at the property, but that means that they aren't living at the dwelling as a single household. So that means that the use is not a C3 use. But that doesn't automatically require planning permission. Planning permission is only required if there is a material change of use. So when we're looking at this type of submission, we need to make an assessment as to whether the use of the property as a residential use is materially different to the use of the property whereby there's 1 young person living there and having care provided by external carers. In this case, there's no alterations, so the property is indistinguishable from its previous use and looks very much like all the rest on the street. In terms of activity, there will be some movements, some vehicle movements associated with it, shopping, all that kind of thing. But with it being for one young person, there isn't likely to be a material change in the number of movements or the type of those movements. People are going to be going, the young person will go to school at school times, staff will change over at typical commuting times. So a lot of the activity and the trips around it will be no different to how the property could be occupied in its residential use. So that comes to the fact that there isn't really a material change of use involved in the application. Quite often with this type of use, we get an application for a certificate of lawful use, which is a way of the operators or potential operators asking the council whether their intended use of the property requires planning permission or not. That hasn't happened here. They've gone beyond that stage and gone to the stage of making a planning application. So we need to determine that planning application. But I think it's fair to say that if we had received an application for a certificate of lawful use, that would probably have been granted to confirm that planning permission would not be required for the use that's being proposed or is now taking place. But notwithstanding that, because there's an application, we have a duty to determine it. So that brings us to my final slide, which is looking at the merits of the application. The property is located in the settlement, so that's where it's where development is promoted in the local plan. It's also in a residential area, so young people should be realistically brought up in an area that is of a residential nature. Touching on the points raised by the parish council about the access to services, in the local plan there's a hierarchy of settlements, and Elswick is identified as a tier 2 settlement, which is towards the bottom end of that hierarchy, but it remains a settlement. It's an identified village. It's got a village green, it's got a play area, it's got a church, it's got sports facilities. There's a school within a reasonable distance. So it is a proper settlement, if you will, in terms of services that are available. As I've said, the vehicle movements are going to be very similar to a residential use, and given the location, it's not down a narrow country lane or anything like that. There is very reasonable access to it. One of the concerns that's raised, and it's a concern raised by the Highway Authority, is about the level of parking. Now you can see, if I go back to the pictures, that there's no formal parking area for the property, and the Highway Authority raised concerns about the use of the forecourt for parking. There's no drop curb there, and there's no that the Highway Authority would be resistant to forming a drop curb because of the position on the bend there. However, it does seem that that area has been used. Obviously, it's a snapshot when the Google Earth van drove past, but clearly it was being used at that time. And I suspect that when it was in use as a fish and chip shop, it will be regularly used by people dropping in and picking up their food. So I don't feel that the parking issue is one that could justify a reason for refusal. You can also see, again, from the pictures, there is the availability of roadside parking. There's no parking restrictions on the road. Those vehicles in the bottom picture are parked there without causing any obstruction. So I think it would be unreasonable to refuse the application on parking grounds. Finally, with regards to neighbouring properties, it's detached from them. It's not a terrace house. It's not semi-detached where there's that nature of direct interaction with neighbours, and it's not one that there's been any objections to the application for. So overall, the recommendation is to grant planning permission.
There we are. There we are. You've obviously got the touch. There we go. Yes, thank you, Andrew, for that presentation. Councillor Armitt has indicated he'd like to speak. We'll open the debate now, if anybody wants to comment.
Thanks, Chair. Look, this doesn't need planning permission, as has been said. If it come for a certificate of use, it would have got it anyway. So I think I've got to move to approve on this. A couple of questions, though. I mean, observation, yeah, it was a chip shop. Cars would have been coming in and out all the time. This will have a lot less travel in and out than that would have had. And it would have had a lot less cars coming in and out than that would have had. So that's a moot point in terms of saying that transport's an issue. If living in a village is such a bad thing, there's nothing to do, then that's a shame for people who live in villages. But that's, again, it seems a very odd thing to argue that where I live isn't a very nice place to live. That seems an odd argument. So I've got to move to approve. But a couple of questions. What we've seen around with a lot of the houses that have opened in this way in St Anne's is a measurable increase in antisocial behaviour and a measurable terrorisation of residents and a measurable upset with residents. And the carers don't take any form of responsibility for they can't keep the child in the house. They're not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to put curfews in. They seem not to be able to punish them like a parent would do for bad behaviour either. And they don't take responsibility for the children outside of the house when they're doing what they're doing. They just look after the kid when they're in the house, but they can't make the child come into the house. That seems a gap. I know this isn't probably a planning permission thing, but it's a certificate of use thing. It's a gap in the organisation, which is not causing much happiness for a lot of our residents. And so an observation is there anything we can do about that? I think the answer is probably no. And secondly, on the provider, I know the last application that came in on this, the provider was not licensed by LCC and was objected to by LCC as an unlicensed provider of service. Is this a licensed provider of service under LCC that we're giving permission to? If it is, and it doesn't need planning permission, then I'm happy to move.
I'll take that answer that question, Chairman, because of my recent dealings with the wider picture in regard to care homes. Towards the end of the last municipal year, I brought an item to this committee, you recall, about the need for planning permission, etc. And that was the committee resolved to pass that to scrutiny to examine the wider issues surrounding care homes. So that process is currently underway. So the first meeting of the scrutiny committee is set up, or set in process, the scrutiny arrangements. So in terms of how children's homes are regulated in the wider picture, outside planning, that's currently being looked at by the council. The subgroup, the task and finish group that's been set up to look at that specifically hasn't yet met, but it's just been scoped, and various organisations, including the county council, the social services provider, Ofsted, police, local community operators, they are all being brought in to answer questions and make presentations to that committee. So that will address this wider picture. And I think the point that you made, Councillor, was about the fact that a lot of this stuff is outside the planning control. So a lot of controls and regulations are 2 or 3 tiers. Planning is one of them. Being licensed with Ofsted is the other. So the key, I think, my understanding of it, and like I say the scrutiny will deepen that understanding, is that Ofsted are the key regulatory body in terms of licensing or registering a premises, and they register the business, the manager, and the property. So they've got all those issues that they look at. So they should be the organisation that addresses those specific issues you've asked in regard to both of those issues, the suitability of property, how the children are managed, etc. So, like I say, in terms of the bigger picture, scrutiny will be addressing that, but I suppose the top and bottom of it from a planning point of view is a lot of those issues there are not material planning considerations, they're other regulations to address, albeit that in the wider public interest, they're obviously something that should be and is controlled. The effectiveness of that control obviously is something that the scrutiny committee will be delving into.
Yeah, just one quite brief clarification from my point. At the end of my presentation, I did say there hadn't been any neighbour objections. That's not correct. There has been one neighbour comment about this application, as reported on the agenda papers. But I just wanted to make that clear in terms of a clarification.
And just an additional comment when I was looking through the report regarding this is that I noticed that the yeah, there we are. Well, it was like that before, but we'll see if it stays green this time. Sorry about that. What I did notice was a condition, I think it was condition 2, that even for future use as a care home, I think it was limited to 1 child. And whilst that doesn't necessarily and what I would say is that if that condition is enforced and respected, that does limit the amount of antisocial behaviour that potentially could occur as a result of 1 child in that particular unit. So I was sort of reassured by that particular condition, because I understand the argument that, for example, I think in the report there's a reference to this, that the objector and other people have not referred. This is a retrospective application, so I believe that there has been an operation there since May, and there has been no reference up until this point of any incidents or antisocial behaviour. So I suppose, although retrospective applications we frown upon in some ways, in other ways, if there is some evidence as a result of usage in this way that hasn't been detrimental to neighbourhood amenity or disturbance or noise, etc., or antisocial behaviour, that in itself is we should be more confident that we won't get problems in that term, in that way. So I just thought I'd point that out. It has been proposed. I'm going to bring Councillor Dixon in now, I think, because I think he indicated, but thank you, Councillor Arnott, for that.
Much more of the same from me, really. There aren't any planning reasons for us to turn this down. No matter how you look at it. I mean, the way these homes operate, yeah, I do share concerns about homes and carers and whether the children can be kept in them or out of them. But that's the very nature of these. It's not a planning consideration. So while we can raise those concerns, we can't say no because of those concerns. And if I was being churlish, you know, I think the objection from the parish council, which likes to sing from the rooftops about its Mooga, which is phenomenal down there, and all the facilities in that village, it doesn't really ring true, and I don't think we can give them the attention it deserves. I have dealt in the past with sporting organisations and people from the community who have struggled to get access to the Mooga because the parish council keep it locked all the time. So, you know, I don't think we can use that either. So, no, I'm happy to second it, Chair.
Now, before we actually moved, Councillor Settle, sorry, come in, please.
Thank you, thank you, Gavin. I think Mark's probably answered this question, but the report does refer to Ofsted and social services. But are they at the moment a consultee, or do we hope they will be a consultee in future when scrutiny have looked at it?
Would you like to address that?
Yeah, obviously I can't second guess what the scrutiny committee will recommend and what the executive committee will take up. But certainly that's something that will no doubt will be considered in that process. I think in terms of the planning applications, let's say we do generally notify the social services of applications. They're not a statutory consultee, but they are an interested body that we notify. With certificates of lawfulness, there are no consultations because of the process. It's a more factual assessment.
But in this case, they haven't replied.
No, no.
I'm going to raise one more question because I suspect that, there would be other people that would look at the presentation in terms of the parking, Andrew, and things like that, and how in its previous use, we've seen cars parked on the front, etc. And it may not be a planning consideration, but I suspect that other people will be thinking this as well. In the event there's no drop curb, we've seen that, so clearly that we would expect parking to be on a residential road. If, however, in the use of this particular unit, cars were appearing on the frontage, in other words, they'd crossed the curb and were parked in front of the house, because there is a forecourt there that almost invites that to happen. It shouldn't happen, but if that was to happen, would that be a contravention of the permission that they're being given in terms of usage? And how, if there were registered concerns from other residents about parking on the front and coming down, is that an LCC matter, or how would that be addressed? Because I hope I'm reflecting, maybe that's one of the questions that some people might ask, is that when you look at the cars parked there, well, what's stopping, carers, whatever, just going and parking their cars on that forecourt, and I would imagine that neighbours might be concerned about that as well. It might not be a material planning consideration, but it is something I think that we ought to just have a quick look at.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Chairman. The parking arrangements of planning application are normally something that we would look to control, look to make sure that there is adequate parking, typically on site. In this case, it seems that there's an informal arrangement whereby cars drive over the curb and park on the forecourt, as you can see on the pictures. Because that curb's not raised, that would be an issue under the highway legislation. It is something that we could prevent through the planning permission. We could put a condition on that says that forecourt shall be fenced off and lawned and shall be not used for parking in visual impact grounds. But I don't think we should be doing that, because I think it probably serves as a useful opportunity for parking. I don't believe there's a parking issue because of the extent of roadside parking that's available in the area and the scale of the use that's involved. We're talking about, we've got one young person, we're talking about up to 3 carers, and we're talking about an area where there is ample roadside parking available. So I don't see that there is a requirement for us to be overly concerned about whether there is or there isn't parking on site. What I have done, obviously that curb situation has been in play for some time, certainly since the 2009 image, because it's unchanged from then, probably before. Looked at the accident figures that we have access through from LCC, and there have never been any accidents in that location. So, or certainly none that are recorded. So it would seem that whilst there has been informal use of the access point, it hasn't created any issues. So I kind of took that as a view of, well, let's let it carry on.
And my final question on that note is then, you've obviously had discussions and negotiations with the applicant in terms of this particular unit, and well, directly or indirectly. But I think on behalf of the committee, I would just like an assurance that the operators are very clear about the position with parking on that forecourt, that they understand. Even a nod would be okay with me, to be honest, as we've got a representative there. You're very clear that, the understanding is there shouldn't be any parking on the forecourt and on the road, and that will be adhered to. Okay, I'm very grateful for the nod. Thank you. As you're physically present, I think we can do that. Okay, thank you. Are there any to Rob, who will give us, I'm sure, a very comprehensive presentation regarding this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, everybody. So the application site is as edged red on the right-hand image. The blue edge defines land within the applicant's ownership. Just to provide a bit of context where the site is, we have B&Q just to the northwest. We have Preston New Road and the roundabout which links up to the M55 junction to the east as well. We've got Plumtree restaurant, carvery and hotel establishments to the east. MKM Builders Merchants and some recently developed industrial units to the southwest and to the south respectively. The site is allocated as employment land in the local plan and forms a much larger employment area known as White Hills in the Blackpool region of the Fylde Borough. Just a few photos for you. This is a recent development that the applicants provided, which lies immediately south of the application site here. The application site is this area to the rear of the building, and as you can see, it's been used as a compound area for the construction of that development to the south. And we've got a bit of spoil, a couple of storage containers, and a bit of surplus materials on the site at the moment too. Just for a bit of context, just a few images of buildings that surround the site. As you can see, they are much of a muchness, industrial in scale, grey cladding, oatmeal, brickwork, dual pitch roofs, those kind of things. Just again, just a couple more images of the buildings that surround the site. Moving on to the development itself. So the building is sited with a back-to-back relationship with the existing building that's just been constructed, with access, vehicular access from Hallam Way and pedestrian access points from Dugdale's Close and Holly Close. We have 66 parking spaces provided within the scheme. 5 electric charging spaces will be provided, and there's going to be infrastructure for more charging spaces when demand dictates. We've got bin and store cycle shelters. They have been relocated as part of the assessment process to the sides of the building, obviously to reduce the amount of development within the open areas located to the front of the building. Boundary treatments are very simple and are basically a timber knee rail boundary treatment. Building elevations, again, the applicant has developed the other 2 industrial sites that lie adjacent. The building design is pretty much identical to those buildings in terms of height, in terms of footprint, in terms of materials that are used. So we're looking at a grey cladding, an oatmeal brick, and contrary to my report or my presentation, there isn't a mosaic detail in this, apologies. Just a bit of a snapshot in terms of the ancillary details. The bin store is going to be a brick bin store. We've got the covered cycle shelter, which is provide the secure and safe space for the cycles, protection from the weather, and then just a quick image of the boundary treatment. Main issues: the site is an employment allocation. Policy EC1 is relevant and supports the uses proposed. We've got job creation from the end use and during the construction process. So because of the land allocation, principle is considered to be acceptable. Design and layout, policy GD7 requires high standards of design, which takes into account character and appearance of the area. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the development certainly is in keeping with the character, the scale of dwellings within the area at the present time. And from a highways perspective, there are no parking problems within White Hills. That's created certainly by insufficient parking relative to other developments within White Hills, and that's leading to a displacement of cars onto surrounding roads. The knock-on effect of those cars on the surrounding roads is that at times vehicles can find it difficult to navigate around White Hills because of the reduction in highway width. There isn't an end user in mind for the development at this present time. So we've done an assessment based upon a worst case parking scenario, which is equivalent to 1 space for every 45 square metres. That dictates an overall requirement of 45 parking spaces for the development. The scheme includes 66 spaces, so there's a surplus of 21 parking spaces. Under normal circumstances, I'd be looking for a reduction in parking on that site to make sure that there's appropriate car parking and to discourage car use and alternative means such as the bus and cycle provision. But because there are known problems of parking in Whitehills, then we're happy to support the surplus. As an add-on to that, mezzanine development within industrial buildings doesn't require planning permission. So in theory, the applicant could incorporate mezzanine floor space within these units and effectively double the amount of floor space that's presently proposed. That obviously could put an additional
Parking demand.
that's the one. Thank you, Mark. An additional parking demand on the development. So we think it's appropriate to control the amount of mezzanine development so as to ensure that there isn't an additional demand for parking in the area, and that's relevant to the surplus of spaces provided. So the surplus of spaces provided is 21, and that's equivalent to approximately 45% of each proposed floor area. So I'm proposing to restrict the amount of mezzanine development to 45% of each unit based upon the surplus parking provision within the scheme. There's sufficient space for large vehicles to exit and enter the site in forward gear. Importantly, the Highway Authority don't have objection to the scheme. So there's no other technical issues to prohibit development, and the scheme's recommended for approval.
Councillor Ahmed, I thought we might get a contribution from you on this one, because you in the past have expressed justifiable concerns, haven't you, about the parking
I was
on
doing
the
that
road?
thinking ahead thing, which we
Yeah.
never do in this committee.
Yeah, okay. I better, it's your go now.
Yeah, so I'm delighted that we've actually finally once got the right amount of car parking spaces to a place that it is impossible to drive through, not difficult, dangerous, really badly designed, really bad planning, really, and we did it. Most people in this room did it, and we did it knowing it was going to be horrible and stupid. So this is great. This is fantastic. We finally got the right amount of car parking spaces. Please don't ever think about reducing numbers. There isn't a decent bus service up to here. Obviously, I would love to say, oh, great, cycle, but the only way to cycle to this place is down the 60-mile-an-hour First World War trenches of School Lane, which nobody in their right mind would cycle down, Cropper Road, which would be insane, or the 50-mile-an-hour bit from Blackpool. So cycling around here, I'd do it, but anybody else doing it would be as mad as me. So no, you can't cycle. I'd love to see more cycling spaces, no buses, only way to get there is a car. It's a white van area as well, so absolutely right to have the right amount of car parking. Totally support that. Great to have more work coming in, so very happy to approve.
Okay, so you're proposing that. Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring Mark in now, because you made a few comments regarding past policy decisions, etc., and decision making, which is not surprising. But I'm just going to let Mark respond to some of the.
As long as he says how long he drives down there.
Okay, all right. Well, I think you will listen, hopefully, anyway, regardless of that.
No, I wasn't going to comment on previous decisions actually, because I did that last meeting. But in terms of cycling to it, of course, the new link road includes dedicated cycleways. So there will, going onto your point about looking forward rather than back, there will be in the future a better pedestrian and cycle links to and from Whitehills to St Anne's.
Councillor Settle.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Emmett has beaten me to it. I'm very happy to accept this proposal and in fact to second it. On the car parking, I fully agree that that area is a complete disaster. It's my favourite road to get up to B&Q. There's cars always on either side. Even in fact, so bad that a white van, as referred to earlier, came the other way when I was driving and smashed my very expensive wing mirror. So it isn't my favourite road, that.
What you voted for, Vince.
Not I haven't done the council, I don't think. So I'm very, very happy to second it.
We've got a proposer and a seconder. Oh, Councillor Pittman and Councillor Morris would like to contribute. Thank you. Councillor Pittman.
Thank you, Chair. I was just a bit concerned about the proximity of this to is it the Plumtree, the pub next door, and how that affects the visual amenity of those who are using that facility. It did seem to me that this isn't an area of great aesthetic beauty, and basically if you've got a grass verge, that's about as much as what you get. So I was wondering just exactly what they intend to plant or place between this development and the Plumtree. I think it's called the Plumtree.
The red areas that you can see on this plan are the landscaped areas. The southern development here has obviously a side-by-side relationship to the existing Plumtree farm. From memory, there are some windows in this side elevation of the restaurant that face into this side gable of the development. Then there's windows to the frontage which face out onto their existing car park. So the development itself won't really undermine Plumtree Farm itself. I think any impact is born primarily from the development to the south. Within that scheme, though, we managed to incorporate landscaping along this boundary, not to screen the building, but to offer some kind of softening impact. And this landscaping that's proposed to the eastern boundary along the Davis Close would have a similar kind of effect to soften it. And say that softening, it's not, like I said before, it's not relative really to the building and users within that building, it's more to the experience of drivers who might access into the car park areas and use it. It's not just going to be grass planting, there will be shrubs, there will be trees in there as well.
Bearing in mind that basically the developers do dump all the rubbish and cover it with a very thin layer of soil, it may be difficult to grow anything outside these particular buildings. I think it's a bit sad that basically they're not going to be particularly well maintained, and it's not going to be the best site, and consequently it's just basic saying there's going to be landscaping is really over egging it, because it's not really landscaping at all. So I'm not thrilled by that. It may look good on paper, but in reality it won't be much. So I have my reservations about what they're planning to do there.
Just to come back on a few items, I suppose at the end of the day we have to bear in mind that this site is an employment allocation. It's there primarily to deliver and create jobs for residents of Fylde. Notwithstanding, obviously, we do need to make sure that the development ticks the design boxes, so to speak. And I have to be honest, the depth of some of these landscaping areas are greater than some of the other depths of landscaping within the rest of White Hills, particularly along Holly Close, albeit obviously it's not next to the hotel entrance. But we can certainly ensure that the landscaping on paper is acceptable. It has acceptable depths of soil, those kind of things, to make sure that the plants are established. So I can do as much as I can to get the appropriate landscaping in there. In terms of maintenance, again, that maintenance will be down to the landowner. They own these two sites along Lytham St Anne's Way, which are kept to a good standard of upkeep, as to the majority of other landscaping areas within White Hills as well. So I've got no reason at this time to say that they won't be looked after or maintained at all.
I have an admission to make here. I'm going to bring Councillor Morris in a second. But sometimes when I travel to other parts of the country and even locally, I have the habit of sort of visiting different sites just to see, how it was there, etc. And I have to say, sad person that I am, that I visited a number of industrial sites in this country just to have a quick look. And I have to tell you, Councillor Pittman, that Whitehills is probably above average in terms of landscaping and the way they present it. So whilst there are always things we would like more of, and I think you're right to raise landscaping as an important element of even industrial development, because, why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we look for high standards? But what I am actually saying is my experience of visiting locally and nationally is that actually Whitehills is probably above average in terms of how that delivers. So just to reassure you, it's pretty good on the whole.
I was just concerned that we set our own standards rather than judge ourselves with the worst around. And I'm no doubt that there are a lot worse, but we should set our own standards.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Mark in here. Yeah.
I think the issue is that the fact that it is seen as being better than other places demonstrates that we are applying our own standards, which are better than other places. So I think in terms of the landscaping, again, I think this was discussed at last time's meeting about the quality of landscaping. The problem with Whitehills at the moment is there are a number of undeveloped plots that are overgrown. When you actually see the landscaping around the actual developed plots, it seemed to be pretty well maintained to me. So, like I say, the balance that you have to strike is getting employment space on there and creating jobs and putting land aside for landscaping. And I think, that generally the balance is achieved when you take all the competing sort of demands on the space into account.
Thank you. Councillor Morris.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm happy to approve this. I've just got one quick question about the mezzanine. I know you said that they could install it without planning permission and you're going to restrict the amount that they can put in. How would you be able to monitor that if they don't need to put planning permission in?
We can't monitor it. Very, very hard to monitor it. Obviously, the strict restrictions in place as a bit of a red flag to the applicant, to the tenant, any future occupiers, that restriction's in place. If we do ever find out by whatever means that that's in place, then obviously we would take action at that time. That wouldn't necessarily mean that we'd get them to remove the mezzanine, that would be beyond the 45%. From an enforcement perspective, we probably invite them to submit a plan application and see what the outcome of that planning application is. And through that, we'd take a look at the parking impact. So whether there's sufficient parking on site, whether it would displace onto the road, the business model, whether it's a low car parking generator, those kind of things. So.
I'll bring Councillor Evans in and Councillor Farrington as well. One thing that occurs to me in terms of this particular application, which I think we just need to look at, is the surplus parking, Rob, on here. And that's a really positive attribute of the application. In terms of, if we create surplus parking, going back to Councillor Ahmed's point about people parking on the roads and everything, we don't have, however, any direct control as a planning authority, have we? Once we've allocated that parking within that space for those businesses, for that application, what's stopping anybody going, well, there's nobody parked there, I'll go and park there, but I'm not connected with that business? Do they have their own enforcement, or do you know from experience whether this goes on where people who work for another unit actually use space on another? Is there any sharing, or are people just trespassing?
Yeah, I mean, are we talking about the opportunity to share? For example,
yeah,
if all these spaces aren't used, is there opportunities for the cars that are displaced onto the road? to park on here?
I think
are we-
I'm raising this as a broad point with that, but also the business of, you know, do the businesses themselves sort of control who parks in the space allocated for those
I think-
units, or can anybody drive in and just use it?
I would say it's more self-policing
Right.
in the sense that if you're a worker in one of these units, then you'd want to park as close to your place of work as possible, as opposed to parking down the road or outside on the streets. We can't really impose controls in the sense that Unit A has to have so many parking spaces and occupants of that have to use this car parking space. Unfortunately, in my experience, if there's an easier alternative for somewhere to park, they will park in that, irrespective of what car parking is provided. The example I probably referred to is in a past life I was responsible for a lot of redevelopment of secondary high schools, and the ethos was there to provide on-site parent drop-off and pick-up. But you can't force the parents to use those spaces, and if there's always an easier drop-off on street, whereas that facilitates parents to get away quicker, then that will be used. If it transpires on the site that not all the spaces are used, then it is an option potentially for the applicant to progress if they want to in terms of approaching other businesses. But there is a danger of that. If a new tenant comes in, he wants those parking spaces, and so it's not going to affect. But ultimately, I can't control who uses these spaces. The important thing is that the appropriate amount of parking is available.
Thank you so much. Councillor Evans, please.
Thank you, Chair. And further to that point, really, as a wider issue, is there an attempt to potentially right historical oversights, maybe, that do we have any sway at all with highways to put some parking restrictions on the main attributing roads in terms of double yellows or parking between 9 and 5, that kind of thing? Is there anything that we can do or we can try and do that would keep those arterial roads in and out of the estate clearer from traffic? Because my experience, like yourself, at the Preston car zone on the way into the Rivers Way, if they put some double yellows down the road into there, and all that happened is the people that were parking on the road there then parked round the corner, causing the problem further along. Unless you look at an overview, and obviously the developers, what they want to do in time is fill all of those units. So while we looked at one of these in the last planning meeting, I believe, and the same discussions took place about another unit, and I can see it coming up time and time again. And then when we finish filling this development, as Councillor Ahmed's already said, the roads are going to be completely clogged. So the question is, in a nutshell, do we have any sway with highways at all to put some parking restrictions in place to this estate? Thank you.
I mean, I'll hand over to the officers in a minute. Obviously, our primary concern here is to deal with the planning application before us, and we're all very content, I think, in terms of the allocations for parking, because you've got surplus places, you've got above the standard sort of provision. But I'm going to take that question and get a response, because I think it's a good question in the wider context, even though it doesn't affect the specific application, if we just make that distinction. Okay.
Yeah, so in the wider picture, the short answer is that once you've granted planning permission, unless another proposal comes forward, you can't revisit that decision. So previous parking levels are what they were based on the policies at that time. In terms of using other powers, such as parking restrictions on those roads, the main issue is that those roads are not adopted. So LCC can't put highway restrictions on them. Whether they are adopted in the future, I honestly don't know where that is going. I think from my limited knowledge of the issues, it was to do with the fact that the previous developer of the site, I think, went into administration and therefore didn't pursue that. But They are, to all intents and purposes, everybody would think they were public roads, but they're not maintained at the public cost because they've not been adopted. So that, for that reason, the LCC aren't able or willing to put the restrictions in place. There have been previous proposals put forward by private individuals to put forward just like a car park on one of the plots. But again, those haven't come to fruition. I suppose at the end of the day, unless there's a parking restriction, why would you pay to go and park if you can, as I was saying earlier, just park outside where you want to be on the road? So it's a difficult one. I don't know, there might be some wider ways of dealing with it, such as a business improvement district, if all the businesses got together and worked together to do that. But that would be much farther away in the future and would need a lot more cooperation between many different parties to bring that to fruition.
And I think I know the answer to this question as well, because it's one of those sort of, it falls between two camps, that we couldn't make it conditionality of this application because probably the boundary finishes where the site joins the common road, but we couldn't do it piecemeal wise and say a conditionality of passing this planning is that we put some restrictions on the either side of the entrance.
Yeah, Councillor Evans is correct. He does know the answer.
Okay. Councillor Farrington.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Evans has somewhat stole my thunder because I was going to raise some of the points he has, but actually I'd just like to develop a couple of them and take them further, if I may. And I had a little bit of deja vu, like I was in a twilight zone when I read through this, because I thought, if I just woken up and relived my life, because we were looking at something very similar a few weeks ago. So it occurred to me, and so a few questions, and I don't expect them instant answers, but one is, are we going to see similar applications? Are the officers seeing similar applications lining up? Do they have advance notice? So that, just parking that one to one side, I think it's dangerous to view individual applications in isolation, because on the grounds of the actual criteria that Councillor Redcliffe puts forward, then we end up having to approve them because there's no good reasons in law not to. But I would say that we bear responsibility as a committee to be a bit more creative. And I think officers and this committee should be thinking about creative ideas to make sure that the longer term provision in that area doesn't do what a lot of people have described as completely clog up the roads, cause accidents. It could be far more damaging than just wing mirrors, and just provide things like overflow car parks, road widening, potential restrictions on roads. And so is there anything we can do creatively, like supplementary contributions at special conditions to go into the estate management to do such things in the longer term? Because this frightens me that we're going to be sat here in a year or two. Councillor Harmer's shaking his head, but I just think perhaps again naivety. I'm new to this, but I always think creatively about things and think, well, there are ways to do this, but have we got the will within this committee and the council to do it? So a few things there, but I just wondered what the officer's response would be. Thank you.
I can come back on a few of those. I think as Mark picked up on before, obviously we can't revisit previous applications, and a lot of the issues that we see in terms of car parking in Whitehills is a consequence of those plan applications. So it's certainly important that the decisions that we make now don't further exacerbate those issues. And relative to parking, that's making sure that there's sufficient car parking on site. But a more recent tactic that I'm certainly looking at in terms of development of Whitehills is this mezzanine issue, to make sure that works can't progress on site without planning permission and further exacerbate what we considered originally to be an acceptable parking position to one that would then become unacceptable. So we are trying to work out the box, so to speak, as much as we can do. In terms of bringing all the businesses together to create separate parking areas and a traffic regulation order kind of strategy, again, there are a number of fundamental issues stalling that, so to speak. Like Mark mentioned, the adopted highway position, preventing the TROs coming forward. A central body, I suppose, to organise all the businesses to come up with some kind of strategy. And then I suppose the third one is getting the buy-in of all those businesses to whatever strategy that might be. So it's not easy. And in all fairness, there aren't a huge amount of plots left within Whitehills to develop for employment purposes now.
I'd just like to come back as well, because I think, you've made some valid points there. And one of the reasons I allow a discussion and questions like that is we can have that broader discussion. I'm simply pointing out that the nature of where we are now and our business is to focus on a specific application. And I think it's good to say this, that we will all look at this application and probably, in terms of past decisions and past applications, that this is going to contribute partly to a solution to some of these problems, in that if you have an application which has additional surplus places, clearly that is not going to contribute to the existing problems that clearly exist there. So we ought to applaud that, and that should be part of the debate as well, that actually this application is something, in some ways, a model application, because it is providing the very spaces that some people might argue haven't been provided in the past and that have led to some of these problems. So in that sense, I agree with you. I'm simply making the distinction that our job today is to decide on a particular application, but I'm quite happy, and always will be, to take questions in a further context for a wider discussion, because I think it is pertinent to the big picture. So, with respect, that's what I'm saying. Could I go on to Councillor?
Very briefly add
Yes.
to,
Yeah.
even if these things aren't things that we can decide that we have in our gift today, the discussion we're having and the views of the committee will inform officers going forward.
Of course.
And will definitely have a positive impact on policies that are developed going forward. I think it's fair to say that.
Yeah. We've got Councillor Griffiths and then Councillor Armitt.
I just wanted to put a bit of a positive on it. I have a family member who has company have 2 of the office spaces on Whitehills, and they're allocated, depending on the size of the office, you were allocated your parking spaces to cover your staff. And I must admit, there's never been mention of any complaints or problems. The people in the building monitor their own parking, and it seems to work fine from what I've heard.
Well, that's a helpful comment, because I was trying to seek clarification on that in terms of how that operates, and clearly that's what we're hearing from officers and from yourself. Okay.
Yeah, just some context for a couple of the new people, because we have been through this for about a decade. A lot of this comes from a massively confused, not joined up approach to green from government. Doesn't matter what government, but the government for the last 10 years or so. The drive has been, you must not supply as many car parking spaces as workers, because workers must not drive. But we won't give you buses, and we won't give you other ways to get there. And you must make it difficult for people to drive, because that's the policy of the government. And therefore, but we won't actually give you any support to pay for your buses to get you there on time or make it able to do it. So we've, in previous ones, when this place first started to develop, some of the smaller ones at the beginning, some of the developments at the beginning of this, you knew you were going to employ 60 people, and we were giving it 20 car parking spaces. And we would sit here, hence my sarcastic comments before, we would sit here and we would argue that the only place they could park on the road. So the reason they won't change it is because that's the employees. They can't get rid of it, because otherwise there'd be no one working there. The place would close down, it would fail. We've been to B&Q and said, you've got a massive car park. Could you give some of that up to it and make it so that you could link it into it? Why should they? They were built in the days when we actually thought that we had brains and we had, people would drive, and you can't get to this place. And yes, Mark's drive across the Moss Road in a January day on a bicycle idea ain't gonna fly. So we designed this badly, and we do it over and over again. If you look at the houses behind booths, we allowed them, because developers will always want to do it, we allowed them to build 2'6" wide roads, 1 car parking space per house, and say that's what you've got to live with. Then of course everybody has 2 or 3 cars, they park it on a road that you can't drive down, and you're going to have accidents, you're going to have anger, you're going to have road rage. We designed that. Now the officers, it's not the officers' fault, the officers are under pressure to not do it. You heard in this application, I looked at reducing the number of car parking spaces. Now, we've got an adequate amount of car parking spaces here. It will be full, but an adequate amount. But the officer looked at reducing the numbers. So we have been forced for a decade to build inadequate parking, inadequate roads, and inadequate infrastructure. And everybody knows that, but we do it. And then we build bad design, bad housing, bad road, bad buildings, and then sit back and go, well, wash our hands, not our problem. Government told us we had to do it. And yet our people in this area have to live with it. And that's what we've got. And that's what we've done for a decade. So this, to me, is fantastic because we finally have the adequate amount of parking to deliver to an adequate amount of working. So this is great. Long live this, and let's keep it this scale going forward.
Okay, and that's a point that obviously I've made in terms of this application. It's the way forward, and we ought to applaud it, etc. I'm going to bring Mark in now. I'd just like to respond to a couple of things.
Yeah, just one final thing, and that is that we have been, as I think as members will know, developing a new supplementary planning document to address car parking. Part of the reason for doing that is that the previous parking standards that we operated were somewhat dated. That will be going to the executive committee as a new policy in due course. The plan was September. I don't know how that will hold up because we've got a key consultation outstanding in terms of the Highway Authority at the moment. So obviously very important to have their views. But it addresses things like bigger spaces, higher numbers of car parking spaces at residential properties. Ensuring design of car parking is also part of it, not just a numbers game, so that you can walk through the car park safely to the premises that you're visiting, etc. So, and the electric vehicles and other types of vehicle parking as well. So all of that information will be coming together. It's just been out to consultation. The consultation ended last Thursday. But like I say, so the next job is to review those comments and then get it to the executive committee. But it's out there. If it's on our website, if people want to Google council supplementary planning document on parking, it will come up and have a look at that. But it does address much of what we've been discussing this morning.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to move to the vote now because we've had a very extensive discussion there, and that was healthy. I think we've had Councillor Armitt, you moved it, and Councillor Settle, did you second it? That's okay. So if we move to the vote, all those in favour, please indicate.
That's unanimous.
And unanimous, so I won't ask the other question.